Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed. I'm Arjuna, and this is the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. Today, I've got Michael Egnor on. I'm very delighted to have him on for a second time. He's a neurosurgeon, a Christian, and he's quite good at arguing philosophy too. So today we're doing an interview on, what did I title it? Problems for materialism and problems from materialism. So we'll start out with him telling a little bit of his story, how he changed his metaphysical views through things he learned about the brain, consciousness, and neuroscience. So Michael Egnor, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Arjuna. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I'm delighted to speak with you. I figured maybe we just start with just a quick recap of my own story. I was an atheist for most of my life until I was in my mid-40s. And I've always loved science. Out of high school, I was in the Army for a short time because I didn't have any money to afford college. Then I went to college, and then I went to medical school. In college, I was a biochemistry major. And I must admit that even when I was an atheist, I had some questions about the adequacy of a materialist view to explain nature. Because, for example, in biochemistry, I just couldn't understand how these incredibly elegant and complex biochemical pathways could simply be the result of atoms and molecules kind of bumping into each other. It seemed to me that there had to be a conductor to this orchestra. But being an atheist, I didn't think that was possible. In medical school, I fell in love with the brain, and I felt that neuroanatomy and neurophysiology was really the philosopher's stone for understanding the human mind, for understanding human existence. And I became a bit disillusioned with that as I began to practice neurosurgery. Out of college, I trained in neurosurgery. I graduated from the University of Miami in 1991 and came to Stony Brook. And I've been on faculty here at Stony Brook as attending neurosurgeon now for about 30 years. I'm a full professor. I'm tenured. I do research. I'm the vice chairman of the department, and I am the director of the training program. So I train all the new neurosurgeons that are coming out of Stony Brook. My own intellectual and spiritual journey is I kind of had a Damascus Road experience when I was in my mid-40s, and I probably shouldn't get into that now, but I at that point converted to Catholicism, and I fell in love with the theology and philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, and really have gotten rather into Thomism. I have gotten involved in quite a few public discussions and debates about various aspects of science and various aspects of metaphysics, particularly as regards philosophy of the mind and neuroscience, as regards Darwinism and evolution, and as regards the existence of God. So I'm always happy to talk about these issues because they're fascinating and very important issues. My problems with materialism go back a long ways. I felt very early on, even when I was an atheist, that materialism had a tough time explaining biology, that there were so many examples of incredibly elegant purposes in biology, something even as simple as the pumping of the heart or of the intricate biochemical pathways, the way the organs work. It was awfully hard to put that together on a purely materialist basis, sort of as just atoms and molecules bumping into each other and fortuitously doing what they needed to do to keep organisms alive. And the Darwinian explanation of things, that basically things changed and survivors survived, and that explained the whole bit, seemed to me to be terribly simplistic. There was clearly a lot more going on there than could be explained in a universe without a mind governing it. So materialism, even before I became a Christian, was something that I had a lot of trouble fully accepting. It's become very clear to me as time has gone on that materialism also cannot explain the mind. I think we can get into that in some detail. But it's also clear that materialism fails miserably in explaining physics. That 20th and 20th century physics is completely inconceivable from a materialist framework, despite what a lot of materialist philosophers say. Materialists often pretend that they are defenders of science. But when one looks with any kind of scrutiny at what modern science is telling us about nature, materialism is a completely inadequate framework to understand any of that. As just a simple example, one of the basic principles of the materialist way of understanding nature is the concept of causal closure. What materialists say is that in nature, every physical effect has a physical cause. So there's no such thing as like an immaterial mind causing things or God causing things or anything like that. Every physical effect has a physical cause. The problem with that viewpoint, and materialists often argue that that's the cornerstone of modern science, is that it's exactly the opposite that's the case. That is, modern science does not respect causal closure in any way. For example, something as simple as the Big Bang, which obviously is a physical effect. In fact, it's all physical effects. It's the entire physical universe, has no physical cause and could not have had a physical cause because physical didn't begin until the Big Bang. So whatever was prior to the Big Bang, if it even makes sense to say prior, it wasn't physical because physical began at the moment of the Big Bang. So causal closure is violated by the very existence of the universe itself. Furthermore, the singularities that are at the core of black holes clearly cause physical effects. Black holes can suck parts of galaxies into them. Black holes are very powerful things. But it makes no sense to talk about the physical cause in a singularity because a singularity is undefined. It's a solution to the tensor equations of general relativity that contains infinities, and these infinities are not defined mathematically or physically. So the effects of black holes have no physical cause. General relativity itself violates the principle of conservation of energy, at least in curved space-time. Einstein's tensor equations of general relativity do not include or do not entail conservation of energy when space-time is curved. Perfectly flat space-time can conserve energy, but none of the actual observable universe is perfectly flat. In fact, physicists or cosmologists have developed modifications of Einstein's tensor equations called pseudotensors to try to bring conservation of energy into general relativity, but it doesn't emerge naturally from Einstein's equations. And of course, if there is no conservation of energy, then the universe is not causally closed, because if you can have energy come from nowhere or energy cease to exist, then the whole concept of causal closure falls apart. The fourth example in physics where causal closure is not valid is in quantum entanglement. Quantum entanglement is a phenomenon in quantum mechanics in which pairs of particles, for example, particles that are emitted together by radioactive decay, have complementary properties. For example, spin, like upspin and downspin on electrons. And these properties remain complementary no matter how far apart the particles are. As an example, if you have two electrons that are entangled, that are complementary, one of them will have an upspin, one will have a downspin. Before the electrons are observed, neither will have either spin. That is, the act of observation then causes a collapse of the waveform, which makes the electron have one or the other spin. If you take the two electrons and you separate them across the universe, so one of them is in front of you, and the other is as far away as you possibly can get in the universe, which might be, I guess it's 93 billion light years now, and you observe the electron in front of you, it will immediately have a spin. Let's say it has a downspin. Instantaneously, the electron on the other side of the universe will have an upspin. Now that's been shown to be the case experimentally, not on the other side of the universe, but there have been many experiments that show that that phenomenon is not merely theoretical, it's real. Quantum entanglement is a very real thing. And the entanglement is instantaneous. That is, it violates the principle that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. So the fact that the electron on the other side of the universe at one moment will acquire a spin, like an upspin, is a physical effect that cannot have a physical cause, because your observation of the universe on the other of the electron on the other side of the universe happened 93 billion light years away, but the effect was instantaneous and no physical cause can act instantaneously. So the materialist philosophers' arguments that modern physics manifests causal closure is complete nonsense. The Big Bang violates causal closure. Singularities and black holes violate causal closure. General relativity violates causal closure. And quantum entanglement violates causal closure. So the materialists really have nothing to say to science. They are mainly an impediment to science. And modern physics, let alone modern biology and modern neuroscience, pretty clearly demonstrate that materialism is kind of a worthless metaphysical framework in which to do science. What's particularly amusing is, and I've been looking at this question now for a number of years, if you ask 10 materialist philosophers, what is matter? Just the question, what is matter? You'll get 11 different answers as to what matter is. And the materialists can't even tell you what matter is. So they certainly can't tell you anything meaningful about physics or about science. So I've come to reject materialism entirely. And I think that Thomistic dualism or hylomorphism, which is kind of a general description of that way of looking at things, is a very successful way to look at things. And I have a lot of sympathy also for idealism, for ontological idealism. But I think materialism is a failed ideology.
They'll give a behavioral explanation of what matter is. Matter has, these properties, it behaves in this way.
Yeah, sure, but behavioral explanation doesn't explain what matter is. And the very fact that matter behaves takes us out of what would normally call a materialistic explanation, because behavior it depends upon physical laws, depends upon goals and purposes and teleology and things like that, of which materialism has nothing to say. Why shouldn't matter behave? And why does it behave according to rules? And rules aren't themselves material. So how do materialists explain the laws of physics? Why do the laws of physics obey astonishingly beautiful and intricate mathematical systems? As was asked many centuries ago, why is nature so elegantly mathematical? And materialism has nothing to say about that, of course, because mathematics is not a material thing.
Yeah.
So I don't think of. Go ahead.
I have a friend, Seth Hart, who I've had on a few times, and he's doing a PhD around the problem evolution and stuff related to that, as well as theology. And he has this argument based on final clauses. I'm not sure what I think of it myself, but basically, if you, I think that's something that can be described completely in third-person terms, we can consider fully physical. So if you have a set of dominoes and you push them over and they all follow a mechanistic process and the last domino falls over, I'd say we can give a complete physical description of that. Therefore, we can call it a physical phenomenon. But he was saying, because of the tendency of each domino to fall and push over the next one and so on, there's a final cause in there, so that you have to bring in teleology to explain it.
Oh, yes. I think teleology is the cornerstone of understanding nature. And that whole system of understanding nature that includes teleology really began with Aristotle. And Aristotle proposed that in order to understand any state of affairs, you can cite 4 causes. And in order to completely understand that state of affairs, you have to understand all 4. The first cause is material, and that is like, what matter is this thing made of? The second cause is formal. That is, what's the structure of the matter? How is the matter organized? The third cause is the efficient cause. And the efficient cause means, how did this state of affairs get built? What was the agent or mover that made this happen? And the fourth cause is the final cause, which he called teleology. And he said that is, in some sense, the purpose for the system. But he didn't necessarily mean purpose in the way that we mean purpose, as if there's a a person thinking there with a plan in their head, although that is one kind of purpose. He meant the directedness, the tendency for systems to consistently do things. They have goals of sorts. And he even pointed out that the causes work in couplets. For example, material cause and formal cause work together in the sense that the form organizes the matter. And you can't really understand material causes unless you understand formal causes, because you can't have matter without form. You can't have matter without some kind of organization. And efficient causes and final causes work together, because you can think of efficient causes as the push and the final cause as the direction of the pushing. So, for example, if a pool player is hitting a pool ball into a pocket, the efficient cause of that action is the pool player hitting the pool ball. The final cause is the pocket that he's aiming at, his intention to get the ball in the pocket. And the pool player is always hitting the ball somewhere. There's always a final cause somewhere. If you don't have final causes, you can't have efficient causes. Efficient causes have to have a direction. You have to push in some direction. So Aristotle says you can't really understand causation without taking all four of these factors into account. And he said, actually, the final cause is the most important cause because it gives a directionality to the whole process. Processes without directions are very difficult to understand. If you understand the direction, you've made an excellent start on understanding the process. So teleology is not only a part of understanding nature, it's the cornerstone of understanding nature.
I'm finding myself thinking about this phenomenon where if somebody's stated intention for performing a certain action doesn't match up with the obvious consequence which will happen, and the consequence which does in fact happen, then we can infer that their stated reason is not their real reason, and their real reason is to get the result that they actually did get. I don't know if
you... Sure. Yeah, oh yes, of course. And what's kind of interesting, and we can get into this a little more in philosophy of mind, is that there's a philosopher named Franz Brentano in the 19th century who proposed what I think is the best definition of what distinguishes a mental state from a physical state. Brentano asked the question, is there any unique thing that all mental states have that no physical state has? And he said, yeah, it's intentionality. And by intentionality, he meant that every mental state is about something. There is a mental directedness. For example, every thought you have is a thought about something. You can't really have a thought that's not about anything. I can think about Washington, D.C., I can think about my family, I can think about God, but you can't just think unless there's some aboutness to it. Whereas physical things are never about anything. This pencil, in and of itself, isn't about anything. It's just a pencil. I can mentally attribute aboutness to it, but the pencil itself isn't about anything. So Brentano said that intentionality is a cornerstone of what mental states are. And interestingly enough, this directedness in the mental state is the analog in the mind to teleology in nature. That is, intentionality is kind of a personal form of teleology, a purposefulness, a directedness. So in a way, there's evidence for a big mind in nature, just like there's evidence for an individual mind in human beings.
I was having this discussion with someone online a while back. I was making a point similar to yours, and like I gave the example of a photo, and they made it. That maybe they gave the example of a photo of Socrates, and I said, all you have in a photo is pixels which resemble Socrates, but the resemblance only exists in the mind. Like sometimes people have a neurological problem where they can't pick out the resemblance, and I think monkeys and other animals have trouble with that kind of thing. And then he was saying, well, the photons from the camera that hit the camera having bounced off Socrates makes it about Socrates. I'm like, well, not really. I mean, supposing he had an identical brother that when the photo was taken, it wasn't actually taken of him, it was taken of someone else. The photo could be identical in every way. So how could it be about Socrates rather than his brother, or vice versa, depending on who the photons bounced off, when the photo itself is no different?
Sure, absolutely. Another good example is many times people think that they see the Blessed Virgin Mary in a piece of French toast. They'll all these stories about people seeing images and things. And not to say that there aren't genuine apparitions, but some of it certainly is coincidence. But whether or not you see the image of your favorite saint in an inanimate piece of matter is a mental thing. It's not in the matter. I mean, the Blessed Virgin is not in the toast. It's your mental perception of what's there. And that intentionality, that directness of thought shows up in nature. Nature kind of acts in some ways like there's a mind behind it.
So maybe we could talk a little bit about, I titled it Problems for Materialism, Problems from Materialism. I've had a candidate on who's quite into philosophy of mind and metaphysics, and he reckons one of the reasons why modern physics has made such little progress for so many decades is because of physicalism. Because, scientists have created this box for themselves of, all their explanations need to be physical and fit within a certain metaphysical outlook of the world, which is very restricting. So they won't look outside of that box. And he reckons if they were to look outside of the box, then science could start progressing again.
I think that's exactly true. I think that's exactly true. And it's remarkable. In our era, in the last maybe 100 years, it's certainly true that many, if not most, of the leading scientists in the hard scientists have been atheists or agnostics. That's kind of the fashion. There certainly isn't anything about the natural world that would lead an intelligent person to embrace atheism or agnosticism. I think just the opposite is the case. But it's fashionable, and quite frankly, if you're a professing theist of any sort in the scientific community, it doesn't help your career. It doesn't move you along. However, the great scientists of the past were almost all devout believers in God. And even those who weren't particularly devout still believed in God. Einstein was not an atheist at all. He said his career was trying to read God's mind. Schrodinger was not by any means an atheist. Heisenberg was not an atheist. Planck was a devout Christian. Maxwell was a very devout man. Faraday was what we would call a fundamentalist. Newton wrote more about the book of Daniel than he did about physics and math. I've read some of his interpretations of the Bible. He was a very profound biblical exegete. So the great scientists were devoutly religious people. And it turned out that when materialism or physicalism came to dominate science in the mid-20th century was when a lot of the great discoveries stopped happening, when things sort of dried up. So yeah, physicalism, doing science as a physicalist is like driving your car with a parking brake on. It's a major impediment to science.
Right. This relates to another question of why is philosophy dead? Like I heard someone giving a talk and they said, they asked the audience, can anyone here name one living philosopher? And nobody was able to do it. Whereas in previous stages, the philosophers were like the rock stars of society. Like when
Absolutely.
Immanuel Kant, I think it was, when he was dying, like all these people gathered around. It was like, what we might do
Absolutely.
for the royal family today or something.
Sure.
And one of the reasons why philosophy is dead is because scientists who are not trained in philosophy make philosophical statements. So it's like there's this, hunger people have for philosophy, and they're getting it met through the junk food of bad philosophy done by scientists. So
absolutely,
they have this urge for something philosophical, and they think they're getting it from science, but none of these people are actually doing it. So scientists are pronouncing on science despite having no training. They're pronouncing on philosophy despite having no training in philosophy, which means they're doing it absent all the rigor which would normally go on in the discipline of philosophy.
Yes, and I must say that one of the things that really helped me in my conversion to Christianity, away from atheism, was besides my Damascus Road thing, I spent a few years pondering these issues rather deeply. And belief in God started to make sense to me for all sorts of reasons. But I was secretly kind of afraid of debates. I was afraid that the atheist case was so strong that if I looked at it carefully, that it would sort of extinguish my faith. So I went at it kind of carefully, and I started listening or reading atheist debates with Christians and so on. And I was amazed, and frankly, I'm still amazed, even though I've been reading it and even doing it for years. The debates for materialism, the debates for atheism, and let's face it, atheism and materialism are peas in a pod, are the arguments for them are utterly stupid, meaning that these are really almost subliterate arguments. A very good example is scientism, which is a degenerate form of logical positivism. Scientism is the view that the only thing we can know really for certain is stuff that can be proven scientifically, that science is sort of the gold standard of knowledge. And the problem with scientism, if you think about it for a moment, is that assertion itself is not something you can prove scientifically. That is, that scientism isn't a scientific theory. So the assertion that science is the only way to knowledge is itself not a scientific kind of knowledge. So scientism is self-refuting. But it has been hawked by any number of Nobel laureates and world-famous scientists, and it's idiotic. It's something that a clever 12-year-old could see through. So yeah, the materialism and atheism are intellectually vacant, vapid ways of looking at the world, and the fact that they are believed by a fair number of leading scientists is an enormous indictment of the scientific profession.
I'm being called out in the comments for giving a straw man. So there are many philosophers doing great work today. My point is most people don't know about it. So circles I'm in on Facebook, and probably a large number of people who follow my YouTube channel do know who can name many great living philosophers. So
sure,
I just mean most people out of the public. And secondly, I'm getting called out for a straw man because philosophers and people do call out scientists when they make bad philosophical statements. But that may be the case, but they still get away with it in the eyes of a large amount of the general public.
Yes, and none of the good philosophy being done today is being done by any materialist. That is, that whatever good philosophy is being done, and there is some good, is being done by people who at least in part reject materialism. And the good part of their philosophy is the part that rejects materialism.
Yeah. So maybe we could move on. Did you want to get more into the metaphysics now, or the neuroscience?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I think the metaphysics is a good way to start. Just to give a kind of a brief overview of what the options are regarding neuroscience. Because at this point, if you'd like, I'd like to focus on neuroscience and the question: what is the best metaphysical framework in which to understand the relation between the mind and the brain? Based on a neuroscientific perspective. To start out, there are three ways that mental states and physical states can be understood, broadly speaking. The first is materialistic. And there are three basic materialist approaches to understanding the relationship between the mind and the brain. The first one is reductive materialism. And reductive materialism pretty much always takes the form of what's called identity theory. And identity theory is the theory that mental states are identical to brain states. It doesn't mean that mental states come from brain states or that they correlate with brain states, but that they are brain states. And they are brain states in the view of the identity theorists in the same way that the evening star and the morning star are both the same thing. They're the planet Venus, just understood from different perspectives. Of course, the problem with identity theory is a couple of things. One is that there is nothing about mental states that is the same as brain states. And I say nothing. That is that brain states, for example, involve mass, they involve color, they involve weight, they involve dimensions, they involve chemistry. Mental states involve feelings, beliefs, perceptions, intentions. There's no crossover of the two Venn diagrams. So to say that a mind state is the same thing as a brain state is to violate what's been called Leibniz's law. And Leibniz's law is that in order for two things to be identical, they have to be identical. They have to be the same thing. And there's nothing in common whatsoever. The other reason why identity theory fails from a philosophical perspective is what I call the representation problem. You can also call it the perfection problem. And here's a good example. Imagine conceptually what a triangle is. And don't think of it in terms of a picture of a triangle, but in terms of the definition of a triangle, sort of abstractly. So a triangle is a plane figure that's closed with three sides. The sides are straight, and the angles of the internal angles add up to 180 degrees. Now, imagine, can that concept be instantiated in a physical state? Is there any physical state imaginable that is perfectly flat, that has perfectly straight sides, and whose interior angles add up to 180 degrees? And the answer is, of course, no. That is, any physical representation of a triangle, no matter how carefully you draw it, is not going to have perfectly straight sides, is not going to have exactly 180 degree angles, is not going to be exactly flat, even though from a mental state standpoint, those things are perfect. So therefore, the argument that a brain state is a mental state cannot be true, certainly, of triangles, because a mental state of a triangle is a perfect state, and a brain state of a triangle can never be perfect. So another example would be logic. For example, in mental states, we use logic all the time. We'll use modus tollens, that if A, then B, not B, therefore not A. So that's a subtle, logical, validly logical inference. However, there is no physical state in which relations between physical things follows modus tollens. In a physical state of the brain, you have electrochemistry, you have anatomical relationships, but none of the relationships in the physical brain have logical structure to them. So it makes no sense to say that a mind state is the same as a brain state when mind states encompass logic and brain states never encompass logic. So reductive materialism, which is identity theory, is just nonsense. It's just intellectual garbage. The second kind of materialist view of the mind-brain relationship is non-reductive materialism, and that's used to take the form of behaviorism. The idea that the only thing that is worth knowing or that can be known about the mind is the relationship between the input to an organism and the output of the organism. And once you understand how organisms behave in response to inputs, you understand all there is to know about neuroscience. That is pretty clearly kind of a silly way to look at the mind, because it leaves out the mind. It leaves out what goes on inside people. I think it's probably the only philosophical perspective. Well, number one, there are no behaviorists today. That is, behaviorism in philosophy of the mind is completely dead. It dominated philosophy of the mind for 40 or 50 years, and then it completely disappeared. I think it's the only philosophical perspective that has been basically killed by a joke. And the joke goes that two behaviorists are in bed after a night of passionate love, and one behaviorist turns to the other and says, "That was good for you. How was it for me?" And so behaviorism really kind of misses the important stuff in life, and it's just nonsense. The other non-reductive materialist view is functionalism. And functionalism is the idea that basically the mind is what the brain does. And so the mind is basically the function of the brain. And the most common manifestation of functionalism nowadays is computer functionalism. And materialists view mental states as basically the software, and the brain state as the hardware. And the problem with functionalism, and particularly the computer functionalism model, is that if you look at the functioning of the mind as an algorithm, which functionalism naturally lends itself to, you cannot explain how meaning occurs in a thought. Algorithms never have meaning in them. That is, algorithms match an input to an output in accordance with a set of rules. But the meaning of the input and the meaning of the output are not a part of the system. A very good example of that is a word processing program. You can use a word processing program to type an opinion that you have, and then you can use exactly the same word processing program to type the opposite opinion. And the program doesn't care whether you type yay or type nay. It doesn't matter. So algorithmic processes are blind to meaning. Another way of putting it is that they're blind to semantics. They're just syntax. So to explain the mind as an algorithmic process, which is what functionalism basically is to fail to explain how any thought can ever have a meaning. And if you leave meaning out of thought, you really don't have much of a theory of mind. So functionalism is also a garbage theory that doesn't make any sense. There is a group of materialists who have proposed a third alternative of a materialistic understanding of the mind, and those are eliminative materialists. And eliminative materialists try to solve this problem, and I do give them credit. They realize that identity theory and behaviorism and functionalism are garbage. They don't work. So eliminative materialists say the mind doesn't exist. That is, the only thing that exists is brain states. And we have foolishly thought that we have minds. One can get into that rabbit hole rather deep, but it's a pretty crazy way to look at things. It's very hard to make a convincing case that you believe that there are no beliefs, which is basically what eliminative materialists are saying. So if someone tries to make an eliminative materialist argument, I think the best thing is just to move as far away as possible, just to get away from them, because it's pretty crazy, and it obviously isn't a viable theory of mind. So those are the materialist views of mind. None of them, in my view, make any sense. Idealism, I think, is a highly respectable way of looking at the mind. What idealists say basically is that everything is mental, and that even physical things are, in their fundamental ontology, mental things. And you can make a real case for that. And in the Christian tradition, that case is made by sort of the Augustinian insight that reality is a thought in the mind of God. And in that sense, I think you can make a very strong case for idealism, and kind of a Platonic idealism in which the Platonic world of forms really is God's mind. The viewpoint that I think makes the most sense is dualism. And in the dualism that I think makes the most sense is Thomistic dualism, which is St. Thomas's elaboration of Aristotle's hylomorphism. There are other kinds of dualism, for example, Cartesian dualism and property dualism, that I think are respectable. For example, Cartesian dualism has something to say for it. I think it's a mistake, and I think Descartes made terrible mistakes philosophically, but it's worth looking at. And property dualism, I think, has major flaws, but it's not entirely crazy either. But Thomistic dualism, I think, makes the most sense. I should also point out that parenthetically, I have some sympathy for panpsychism, the belief that everything has a mind. I don't think it's true that everything has a mind, but I think panpsychists have some insights that are worth recognizing. So
I like
that's my philosophical.
I like that explanation of why I think it was functionalism doesn't work, because the algorithms, you could say, which go on in the brain, they don't, if you're just trying to explain it as material, like you gave the example of word, the inputs and outputs, whether they have meaning or not, the software has nothing to do with that. So you can't say there's meaning contained within it.
Precisely. Yeah, that's the whole problem with functionalism, is that it eliminates meaning. And how could you have a philosophy of mind that eliminated meaning?
Like you can't explain qualia using, if you want to say the mind's material, because qualia is it has that quality of aboutness. It's what is it? John Searle gives a description of what consciousness is. It's qualified, unified qualitative experience. And which is quite nice.
Sure.
Unified means, we have a singular experience. So, you can look at your yard and you can block your vision and see half of your yard, but you've got a singular experience of seeing half of your yard. You don't have half an experience. Although that does get into split brain patients, because people argue that split brain patients have two personalities and two experiences, but I don't think that's necessarily supported by the evidence.
Right. The evidence is just the opposite, although the split brain stuff is absolutely fascinating stuff, and we will get into that. The qualia problem was basically created by modern philosophers. Qualia was not recognized as an issue by the classical philosophers, the scholastic philosophers, and so on. The whole notion of qualia was not considered a particularly interesting notion because it was quite obvious how we have first-person experience. The reason that qualia became a problem was really started with Descartes, although he obviously built on materialist perspectives that were in the air in the 17th century when he worked. But what Descartes did was he really cast aside the classical Aristotelian hylomorphic understanding of nature, which I think is the deepest insight anybody has ever had into the way nature works. And what Descartes did was he said that things that exist in the world can be broken down into two categories. One is res extensa, which is matter, which is just stuff that is extended in space. And the other is res cogitans, which is thinking stuff. And thinking stuff was spiritual, and it was the mind. And he believed that human beings were composites of res cogitans and res extensa. We were immaterial spirits grafted on to material bodies. And Gilbert Ryle, a contemporary philosopher, referred to that as the ghost in the machine. And that may be a somewhat dismissive approach to what Descartes really meant. But he did believe that we were, in a sense, ghosts living in bodies, which is not at all an Aristotelian or Thomistic way of understanding human beings. The problem with that view is that takes qualia, that takes first-person experience entirely out of bodies. What it says is that our subjective experience is entirely in the res cogitans, it's not in the res extensa. So in the body, there's no first-person experience. Only the mind has first-person experience. So what happened with modern materialism, and most materialists don't even realize this, but modern materialism is just degenerate Cartesianism. What modern materialists did is they swallowed Descartes' metaphysics, and then they just got rid of res cogitans. They just said the whole world, everything, is matter extended in space, and that's the whole story. There's no minds out there. So, of course, if you take matter extended in space that is defined as that which lacks first-person experience, you're going to have an awfully difficult time accounting for first-person experience because you put first-person experience in the garbage. So materialists have defined matter as that which cannot have first-person experience. And then they write libraries full of books trying to explain how matter can have first-person experience when they're the ones that cause the problem. So if we dump Cartesian metaphysics and dump materialism and go back to Aristotelian hylomorphism and to Thomistic dualism, these problems disappear. There's no problem in Thomistic dualism as to why you have first-person experience. That's a simple power of your soul. That's how your soul works. It's not the least bit mysterious.
Bakandadi, who gives a Vedic explanation of consciousness and the metaphysics and all that, he reckons what we do when we experience the world is basically identical to what people do in remote viewing. So we get data from our senses, and by the time it reaches, this is one of his arguments too against the brain explaining consciousness. By the time it reaches, at the end stages of its processing, you have about 20 pixels worth of data. So he thinks what happens is, that the information that comes from your senses gives you reference points, and then your senses actually are out there in the world connecting with reality, your spiritual senses. And obviously you need to explain why some people who have bad senses have see things poorly or hear things poorly. So I guess the senses are also the information from the senses are also modifying the way in which we perceive.
Sure. It's a classic debate in philosophy of the mind. It goes back really to John Locke as to what we perceive when we perceive. That is, what does perception mean? And what Locke argued is that what we experience in our minds is our perceptions. And what perceptions are essentially are pictures of the outside world that are projected onto our brain in some form. Dennett has called this, and actually it's a pretty clever thing, the Cartesian theater. It's as if there's a little us sitting inside our brain in a little theater, and our eyes are shining movies and our ears are shining audio, and everything's coming into this theater. And the problem with that way of looking at things, and I think that's a mistaken way to look at things, a very mistaken. I think Locke made a terrible mistake. The problem with that way of looking at things is that it completely cuts you off from reality. That is, that if you're living in a theater, then you're utterly dependent upon the projector and the audio system to tell you what's out there in the world, and you have no direct contact with the world at all. But if you have no direct contact with the world at all, you can't communicate with other people because you can't be sure that even other people exist, let alone that what you're hearing from them is what they're really saying. You can't do science because you can't even know that nature exists. It may just be some movie that's being played in front of your eyes. So the Lockean way of looking at this as like a Cartesian theater, I think, is a serious mistake. The Aristotelian way is that the form of the object that you're perceiving actually comes into your mind, that your mind is in a way all things, that you connect to the outside world in a direct way. And St. Thomas emphasized something I think is quite beautiful, actually, is that we don't see our perceptions. Like if I'm looking at a tree, what I'm looking at is not my perception of the tree. I'm looking at the tree, the real tree. And what my perception is my perception is that by which I look at the tree. The perception is the means by which I perceive. It is not the end of my perception. The end of my perception is the object itself. And that idea he extended to meaning as well as perception, when he said that the meaning of something is not that which we understand, it's that by which we understand. Meanings are, in the intellect, analogous to perception in the senses. They're the means by which we encounter the world. They're not what we encounter. So we don't understand meanings. We understand things. Now, things may be ideas. Things may be God. Things may be forms. But the meanings themselves aren't what we understand. What we understand are the things. And the meanings are the means by which we understand. So it's a very beautiful way of looking at perception and understanding.
The whole Cartesian theater thing creates a regress problem too, because it's like, well, if you've got data being presented, sensory data being presented to the homunculus inside the brain, then what's going on inside the homunculus? You then have another Cartesian theater inside of there. Where does it stop?
Precisely. Precisely. At some point, you have to assume a homunculus that is not a materialist. So I figure let's just make the whole thing not a materialist.
It makes me think of epistemology, which I guess how we perceive the world is directly related to epistemology. So the same kind of thing the same kind of infinite regress can go on in some epistemological views, where it's like, so I'm being appeared to treely is how the philosophers talk about it, rather than I'm seeing a tree, because all we have is a perception of a tree. But then it's like, well, how do you know it's a tree? And then you give an explanation how you know it's a tree, and it's like, well, how do you know that? And it could go back infinitely. So if you can just say, stop somewhere. Of course, epistemology is a whole other discussion. So I was just pointing out the parallel.
Well, it's remarkable that the word epistemology was coined in the 19th century. That is, that there wasn't even, epistemology wasn't a thing until the 19th century. And the reason I think is because of Hume and Kant's skepticism led people, in their skepticism, I think, is very misguided, led people to question their senses and their understanding of the world for no good reason. The way that the scholastic philosophers and the classical philosophers explained knowledge was very straightforward. Our mind grasps the forms of the things in the world. So there's no problem with explaining how we can know things. The intelligible aspects of things in the world are in our mind. So that's how we know. So epistemology is a brand new problem. And it's a brand new problem because we got the philosophy wrong, beginning in the 17th and 18th century. And we screwed it up so badly, we had to invent a whole new field of philosophy to try to fix the problem that we created in the first place.
I think there's some truth to that. I do think many problems in philosophy are invented problems. But
Right.
I do think
Right.
that epistemology as a discipline of philosophy has merit. Like in Vedic thought, they talked about, the word they used was pramana, which meant proof. So there were three different categories, that when you boil it down to the simplest, you get three different categories, which is pratyaksha, direct sense experience, tarka, which is logic, and the third one is testimony, and the Sanskrit is shabda pramana, so shabda brahma, which is transcendental sound vibration. So the highest evidence you can have for something is revealed knowledge. Obviously, most people aren't going to accept that, but you get the same kind of thing going on in science. So what do scientists do? They look empirically at the world. Well, actually, a lot of what they do is accept the testimony of other scientists who've gone and looked at the world. So, our own direct experience, and then you talk about the faults with the different things. So our sixth experience can fail because, the moon looks like it's the same size as a coin, but actually it's much larger than a coin. Logic can fail because someone who's an expert logician can argue any conclusion. So you can't actually, and then, like popular opinion can't get you conclusions. So real conclusions come from accepting statements from an authority, from someone who actually knows the truth. When you accept what they say, then you also know.
Yes. Yeah, but when I show disdain for epistemology, I certainly don't mean to show disdain for a thoughtful investigation of how it is that we know things and what we know, because certainly that is long as a very honorable tradition in philosophy. But it is true that epistemology as a discipline in philosophy really didn't begin until the 19th century. And so it wasn't thought of as a separate problem. And it wasn't until that skepticism that arose with Hume and with Kant, it wasn't until then that people saw a radical problem with knowledge. That is, knowledge prior to that was understood as something to be explored, but not something to be doubted. It was understood. And with Hume and Kant, the problems they raised was, how can we even have knowledge? And I believe that came from philosophical mistakes.
I reckon to solve those epistemological problems, we just need to make two very simple assumptions. One is that we have an ability to know. So, we have a mind and it can access truth if we use it properly. And, and we have senses and all that. And two, phenomenological uniqueness, or the identity of phenomenology with ontology. So what I mean by that is you can't have two things which are identical in our experience and perception of them under scrutiny, which are ontologically different. So, you have fake leather and you could think it's real leather, but if you scrutinize it, you'll find out, oh no, this is fake leather.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think there are fascinating ways to look at those issues. I think we were sent down a rabbit hole by the skeptics of the early modern era. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some very interesting questions to ask about that, for sure.
So what would you like to move on to next?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if it works for you, I think talking about what neuroscience can tell us about the relationship of the mind and the brain could be a fascinating discussion and a very profitable one.
Yeah, well, we're right at the 1 hour mark, so that gives us one more hour.
Yeah. Perfect. We can, in that respect, ask the following questions. If one is to try to understand the mind in a coherent, consistent framework, one wants to have a metaphysical perspective that does the job, that makes sense. And again, I think there are three different metaphysical perspectives that one could consider: materialist, idealist, and dualist. I will compare directly materialist metaphysical perspectives, specifically identity theory, which I think is a theory that's being argued for the most strongly now by a materialist, and Thomistic dualism, which is my own perspective. And neuroscience, I think, can help us to understand this framework, or put another way, by looking carefully at the results of neuroscience, we can get a sense as to what framework works the best in understanding it. And there are three questions in neuroscience that I think can be asked in this regard. And the very first question is the mind metaphysically simple? And by that, I mean, are there at least aspects of the mind that cannot be divided into parts? Because material things can always be divided into parts. That is, I can take any loaf of bread and cut it any which way you choose. So material things, you can always make two out of one. But immaterial things, it's very difficult to see how immaterial things like spirits or souls can be split in two. So the first question is the mind metaphysically simple? The second question, which is kind of related to the first, but is a separate question, is the intellect immaterial? And what I mean by that is our ability to think abstractly caused by matter or not? At first, it seems to be a wholly metaphysical question, but as it turns out, there's a great deal that neuroscience can say about that, and I think, frankly, that neuroscience addresses it in a fairly clear way. The third question one can ask is free will real? Do we really have free will, or are we, in one sense or another, meat robots, where we're physical organisms whose behavior is compelled entirely by material processes? And again, neuroscience can also speak to that, and I think speaks to it rather clearly. So let's begin with the question of, is the mind metaphysically simple? Can the mind be cut? And the best research on that was done by a physiologist named Roger Sperry, who worked in the mid-20th century. And Sperry won the Nobel Prize for his work. And his work is based on an operation that was developed in the 1930s and 40s called corpus callosum. It was recognized in the early 20th century that some patients who had intractable seizures, intractable epilepsy, had the seizures because a little tiny seizure would start on one side of the brain and then propagate across to the other side of the brain and cause them to go unconscious and have a generalized seizure. And if you could stop that little seizure from propagating, you could really improve these people's lives. So neurosurgeons began doing experiments on animals in the 1930s and 40s, where they would cut the fiber bundles that connect the two hemispheres of the brain. This fiber bundle was called the corpus callosum. And it's a huge fiber bundle. It's literally the size of my hand. And it's this mass of billions of axons that connect the two sides of the brain directly. And that's the highway that these seizures would travel through. And what was found in animals and subsequently found in people is that you could cut that entire fiber bundle. And neurologically, the animals and the people would really be okay. It wouldn't have any dramatic effects on people. And but it would stop the seizures. So it was a very good treatment for epilepsy, and we still do it today. Sperry, being a neurophysiologist, realized that these were patients whose hemispheres were functionally disconnected. And that was a wonderful opportunity to study the functions of the hemispheres. Like, how do the hemispheres work? This disconnection was kind of an experiment of nature. So he did experiments on hundreds of patients who had this operation. And these experiments have become very famous. Just a quick review of the neurology of the operation and the hemispheres. The right hemisphere of the brain controls the left side of the body. It also is the means by which you see the left field of vision. So if you look straight ahead, everything to the left of the midline is seen through the right hemisphere of your brain. So a way of looking at it is that the right hemisphere of the brain sees the left side of your world, and it controls the left side of your body. Conversely, the left hemisphere of the brain sees the right side of the world and controls the right side of the body. The right hemisphere of the brain does not normally have language. So the right hemisphere of the brain is not capable of generating words, whereas the left hemisphere is capable of generating words. The right hemisphere is rather good at spatial relationships and geometrical things. So with this in mind, Sperry did a whole bunch of experiments. He showed all kinds of really neat things. He showed that if you have a person who's had a corpus callosotomy, that operation, and you show him in his left visual field, which his right hemisphere sees, a letter, and you ask him what that letter is, he will indicate that he knows what the letter is, but he can't say the word. He can't say it. But if you give him a basket full of plastic letters, he'll pull that letter out of the basket. So he knows a letter, he just can't say it, because the hemisphere that sees that visual field isn't his linguistic hemisphere. And the information can't get across because the corpus callosum has been cut. So there are all kinds of neat experiments he did. He won the Nobel Prize for it. And people have taken those perceptual disabilities and extrapolated from that to say that you create two people. You know, there's the people who see this half of the world, the other person sees this half of the world. And of course, Sperry didn't believe that at all. What I have seen with these patients, and I've dealt with quite a few of them, and what Sperry saw also, is that these are, for all intents and purposes, completely normal people. You meet these people, sit down, talk with them. They're not two people. They certainly don't think they're two people. They have very subtle perceptual disabilities of the sort we talked about, but they don't even notice them. That is, the patients, and that's why Sperry won the Nobel Prize for this, is that this stuff was so subtle that no one before him had noticed it. So this splitting the brain in half does not in any meaningful sense split consciousness in half. It just gives you a rather interesting but very subtle set of perceptual disabilities. And Sperry was not a materialist. He thought materialism was an idiotic way of looking at the brain. He was a monist, and his philosophy is kind of difficult to describe. But he saw the brain as a unitary thing, but he was definitely not materialist. He also wasn't entirely dualist. There has been some absolutely intriguing work done since Sperry on these patients that I think very clearly shows the existence of an immaterial aspect of the mind, or at least shows that the mind is in fundamental ways not splittable. It's not material. The first kind of this work was done by Justine Sargent, who was a physiologist working at McGill in Canada. And Sargent extended Sperry's work in the 1980s, and what she did was absolutely brilliant work. She took these same patients who had had split brain surgery, and she would show in their visual fields either consonants or vowels. So she would flash a K or an A or a P or an I in their visual fields. And she would ask them to push a button when they saw a vowel or they saw a consonant or whatever. So a patient would be sitting there, she would be flashing consonants and vowels in different visual fields. And for example, she would ask them, when you see a vowel anywhere, left or right, push a button. So she'd do it 1,000 times. These people would push buttons or not push buttons if they didn't see it, so on. What she understood about this is that in people who had had a corpus callosotomy, the right visual field was connected to the right arm, and the left visual field was connected to the left arm because of the way the hemispheres worked. But there was no connection between them. So when the person was pushing a button with their right hand, they had to be pushing a button, at least from a material standpoint, based on what their left hemisphere had seen. That is, what was in their right visual field. Their right hand had no way of knowing what was in their left visual field because it was a different hemisphere. So what she found was that if she asked them, whenever you see a vowel anywhere in either hemisphere, push this button with your right hand. The right hand would push the button, whether the vowel was seen by the right hemisphere or the left hemisphere, even though the hemispheres were not capable of material connection with one another. So she said that somehow the right hand knew what it was not connected to materially if the vowel was put in the left visual field. The right hand had no way to, it metaphorically had no way to see it, but it still knew it. And it happened with the other hand too. The left hand could respond to stimuli in the right visual field, even though there was no material connection that would allow information to get to the left hand from the right visual field. So what she concluded, and her work has been extended by a guy named Yasser Pinto, who's also worked a lot recently, that what she called perceptual disconnection with conscious unity. That is, that there was a consciousness to these people that was not disconnected when you cut the brain in half. Now, they didn't make dualist interpretations because they weren't really into the philosophical perspectives. But obviously, this fits very, very nicely the Thomistic dualist view that perception is a material process in the brain, but intellection, that is, concepts, are immaterial and do not arise from the material brain. Our understanding of what a vowel is not connected to a part of the brain. It's an immaterial power of the mind. So Surgeon's and Pinto's work, which is an extension of Sperry's work, is a beautiful refutation of materialism in neuroscience, and frankly, a beautiful confirmation of Thomistic dualism. I can't hear you.
Sorry. Why would it be that the person could push the button with one hand, despite it being in a different visual field, but they couldn't they couldn't say the letter?
Because saying the letter is still a material process. Language is still a material thing. You can disconnect material things, but you can't disconnect concepts. The concepts get across, but the material ability doesn't get across. That is, the left hemisphere can't make the right hemisphere speak. But information in the left hemisphere of a conceptual nature can easily get across. So, without there being a material connection.
So, how would you make it a conceptual versus a material perception? What exactly is the difference? Why is it that, why can't a letter be interpreted as a conceptual concept, and then you could pick out the letter or say the letter? Sorry.
Sure. The difference is the difference between a universal and a particular. That is that conceptual things deal with universals, and particulars deal with individual things. For example, if I look at the letter A and realize that it's a vowel, two different kinds of mental processes are going on. The perceptual mental process is that I see the letter A, and it looks like an A. It's got the shape. It's made a certain color, a certain size. The intellectual process is that I understand that it's a vowel. That understanding that it's a vowel is not a perception. It's intellectual.
So the
perception is actually seeing the letter.
So the person who's pushing the button when they see a vowel, if it's from a different hemisphere than their arm, they wouldn't be able to select which letter it is. They could just say that it is a vowel.
Correct. They might not be able to tell you which vowel, but they can push the button that there is a vowel there.
Right. Yeah. So that does seem to prove that there's a unified experience going on.
Precisely. And what Pinto argued now, and Surgeon argued, she passed away a while ago, but what she argued, and Pinto still argues, is that the best interpretation of split brain research is that perception is split and consciousness is unified. And by consciousness, they mean abstract thought. So this, which is exactly what Aristotle said.
So this relates to how I understand perception in the brain, despite the mind being non-material. That what is it they call it? The brain is a reducer of consciousness rather than a producer of consciousness. So reducer. like it limits it to some extent. It like puts a filter over it. So, you have a light source and you put a lampshade over it. That's like the brain, and you can put different lampshades and get different results. So, so all the evidence that anyone can offer to show that the brain produces consciousness is the same kind of evidence you might have that a tap produces water. You tinker with the tap and the flow of water changes.
Precisely.
So what follows from that is that the brain affects our access to our cognitive functions, so that our cognitive functions, so that the Vedic idea is that we have 5 senses separate from the body. The soul exists separate from the body, but we occupy the body as a machine, and while we're in the body, our ability to do things is limited by this machine. And that applies cognitively. So people think they are their brain. They think they're their mind. So they think, the limitation, like, how could I, because the Vedic idea is you could also be in the body of a fish or that. So how could I be someone who lacks this ability to think? Well, it's very simple. You were kind of like that as a baby anyway, went through different stages, and these different things exist. It's just, when a brain injury happens or something goes wrong or something, then our access to those cognitive faculties becomes restricted. And it's the same with the split. This is what we see with the split brain thing. So, one side of the body has access to perceptions from that side of the body only. It's an access problem.
I totally agree. I really think that the philosophical inference that the brain doesn't generate the mind, the brain constrains the mind, is one of the deepest insights into philosophy of mind. And I think it's very true. And I think it's particularly borne out with results from studies of near-death experiences, that when the soul is freed from the brain, from the body, one has an enormous enlargement of experience, enlargement of knowledge, rather than a loss of knowledge. The body constrains the soul. It's not the source of it.
Yeah, I was going to mention that too. People who have near-death experiences, they'll often report that while they're out of their body, their thinking is faster and more clear. Many of them will report seeing colors and hearing sounds that we don't hear or see in this current body.
It's funny, but going back to St. Thomas Aquinas, this was one of the things that he argued emphatically for, is that when it comes to mental processes or processes of the soul, composition with matter is a major impairment. That is, that he pointed out that of all of the creatures, and that would include inanimate objects, plants, animals, human beings, angels, God, who's not a creature, but all the entities that can think. Human beings have the least of the mental abilities, at least of the abstract intellectual abilities, because we're stuck on matter. Matter slows us down. That angels, which are immaterial minds, have much more powerful minds than we do, and of course God is omnipotent. So matter allows us to function in the material world, but it's a constraint. It doesn't broaden our mind, it limits our mind.
Someone's asking if neuroscientists have explained NDEs.
Neuroscience has worked extraordinarily hard to explain them away, but they haven't explained them at all. There are probably 20 different explanations that have been offered by various neuroscientists, materialist neuroscientists, to explain away near-death experiences. None of them work. They're all nonsense. Obviously, near-death experiences represent real things in many cases. Near-death experiences are exceedingly common. There have been people. It's been estimated that even just in modern times, there have been tens of millions of people who've had near-death experiences. In the category of near-death experiences, I think one should include also out-of-body experiences that can occur in various situations that are not necessarily at the moment of death. There's a wonderful book that I would encourage everyone to read by Carol Zaleski called Otherworld Journeys is the title of the book. She's a literature professor at an East Coast college, but it's a beautiful book. And what she does is she points out that near-death experiences are just a small subset of the kinds of experiences that people have had for thousands of years in all cultures and all times. They're very common. They include religious experiences, spiritual experiences, and she points out the enormous similarities between them. People in ancient Egypt, people in ancient Greece and Rome, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus have these experiences, and there are so many commonalities. But she also says that our understanding of them is filtered through cultural lenses, so that we tend to see these things through cultural lenses. However, when you look at the core experiences, they're remarkably alike. So it's a great book, and it's very much a part of human experience. The scientific efforts to explain near-death experiences are frankly funny. I mean, one of them, a very popular one about a decade ago, was that the tunnel experience that people have is a vague memory of being born, that you went through the vaginal canal, and that was a tunnel. So as you're dying, you have this panic response where you feel like you're being born again and you see a tunnel. I mean, it's really funny. It doesn't explain how people who were delivered by C-section, for example, that would just be suddenly you see this bright light, so who knows, you wouldn't have a tunnel there. So it's crazy stuff. And obviously the neuroscientific efforts to explain near-death experiences is simply an effort to explain them away, not to explain them in any meaningful sense.
Where are we? Yeah, that makes sense. One thing they can't explain is when you have veridical experiences too, like, when someone sees a shoe on the roof of the building, they go and look and there's a shoe there, or if they see a sticker on top of the fan in the room where they were for their operation and they look and there's a sticker.
One of the most famous veridical experiences, and it's been estimated that about 20% of near-death experiences can be confirmed to be veridical. They can be tested. One of the most famous ones was Pam Reynolds, who was a woman who had aneurysm surgery done in Phoenix back about, goodness gracious, it was about 25 years ago. And she was operated on by a neurosurgeon who I know named Robert Spetzler. And she had a very bad aneurysm at the base of her brain, where Dr. Spetzler had to stop her heart for about 30 minutes to rebuild the artery. It was a critical artery in her brain, and he couldn't rebuild the artery if the blood was flowing through it. So he put her on a cardiac bypass machine, and then he stopped her heart completely after he cooled her body temperature down to like 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Then he did the surgery, he warmed her back up again, restarted her heart, and the operation went very well. But for about 30 minutes, her brain was completely dead, meaning there was no electrical activity. Everything was monitored very, very carefully. So after the surgery in the recovery room, she told him that she watched the entire operation, and he thought she was, kidding, or she was hallucinating. And then she described the details of the operation to him, including very tiny technical details of the instruments he was using and the contents of conversations that he had during the surgery. And she described them in meticulous detail. And she wrote a book about it and became very famous. So there are very clear examples of veridical near-death experiences where there's no doubt that people genuinely were able to perceive and understand without any brain function at all.
A couple other YouTubers who do atheist responses to that kind of thing, they did one on Pam Reynolds that's like 3 hours long or something. One of them's actually studying neurology, I think, so maybe we can organize a debate on this subject between you and him.
That'd be fascinating because the setup that she had there was one where there is no way around it, meaning that, for example, she heard conversations, but besides having flat brain waves and therefore no evidence of any brain activity at all, she had headphones on in which very loud sounds were being continuously fed into the headphones so they could see if there were any responses in her brainstem that would allow them to monitor her brain during surgery. So there was so much noise going on that she couldn't possibly have heard what was going on in the operating room, even if she had been awake. So people have tried very hard to explain away Pam Reynolds' experience. and none of the explanations work.
Right. I mean, if you just hear the debunking without actually knowing the story, it might sound like a debunking because they could construe things in such a way. Whereas if you actually know the case, you might be like, oh no, they're misrepresenting that, or they're ignoring this problem for their view.
Right. I've actually not myself encountered a near-death experience with any of my patients. Of course, patients don't always tell their doctors about it. The other thing is that neurosurgeons don't see them very often because when patients have near-death experiences in neurosurgery, they commonly have major brain damage that accompanies it, which limits their memory, limits their ability to remember these experiences. Where you see a lot of near-death experiences is in cardiology, where people will have a cardiac arrest and be resuscitated rather rapidly before they have brain damage. They're capable of remembering. I do have a neurosurgical colleague who had a patient have an out-of-body experience. This is a young child who was having repair of a hole in the skull under general anesthesia. And it wasn't near death, but the kid had the operation. And then after the surgery, the child explained to the surgeon exactly what he did during the surgery in great detail. And the operation the surgeon did is an operation that the child couldn't possibly have known the details because it was an idiosyncratic procedure that the surgeon had not explained to either the child or the family or to anyone, actually. And so the technique was kind of his own technique. And the child told him exactly what he did. I said, yeah, and after I went to sleep, I went up on the ceiling and watched you. It was really fascinating. In fact, the parents were upset with the surgeon because they thought the surgeon forgot to give the child anesthesia.
Right. So,
and they said, why didn't you give my son anesthesia?
I guess the doctor
was. I did. Yes. Yeah, oh, yeah. He's totally. And he's not a particularly religious guy. I mean, this is a very cynical guy who told me about this years ago. And he said, yeah, I don't have any explanation for this, but this kid saw my operation. And he was under general anesthesia with a brain monitor showing that he was fully out, under surgical drapes he couldn't possibly have seen. And he described exactly what I did. And what I did, I didn't tell anybody about.
Right. I have a friend who had a heart operation, and he had an NDE. He said he got to spook the doctor. Maybe I'll do an interview with him. I should see.
Yeah, sure. So NDEs are real things, and I actually think the most important aspect of the neuroscience of NDEs is the enormous discredit that the neuroscientific effort to deny NDEs brings to the profession of neuroscience, meaning that it just shows you that these people will make up anything. The evidence is so overwhelming. So it just tells you that they're not playing an objective game. They have a preconceived ideological commitment, and they'll say anything to back up their ideology.
Yeah, I mean, you're either doing science or you're defending your dogma.
Yeah, exactly. John Searle, actually, who's a philosopher of mind, who is an atheist and who is not a dualist, but he has a tremendous distaste for materialism. And he commented one time, he said, when you look at the materialist theories of the mind, they're so crazy that the only thing you can reasonably conclude from them is that materialists have an absolute ideological commitment, and they will say anything to defend it.
Right.
That's it.
So we've got
which is my impression.
We've got a question. Has there ever been a case of a deaf person having an NDE and reporting verbal conversation later? Or so yeah.
It's a very good question. I don't know. I'm not an expert on NDEs, so there are people who study these things. I have heard that there are blind people who have NDEs where they see things that are veridical that can be checked. That I've heard.
Right.
I'm not sure about deaf people.
That would be the same kind of thing. There's also terminal lucidity, where somebody who they could be deaf, they could be unable to speak, they could be unable to move, and then in the last couple hours or shortly before they leave their body, but that's the Hare Krishna jargon. Shortly before they die, they have terminal lucidity, which means they become lucid. They can sit up out of their bed and have fully lucid conversations before departing.
It's funny that terminal lucidity is very common. It is very well known among palliative care specialists who deal with dying people. It is very well known amongst people who work in hospices, and it is, as I said, it's almost ubiquitous. I've had colleagues seen it. I've not personally seen it in patients. I saw it in my mother-in-law, actually, but which I could talk about. But I never saw it in patients. But again, my patients usually have profound brain damage, and many of them in the last moments of life are paralyzed and couldn't express themselves anyway. I have a colleague named Stephen Post, who's a medical ethicist here at Stony Brook, who has just actually written a beautiful book about the ethics and metaphysics of dying. And he has a chapter on terminal lucidity. So I encourage anybody, I don't know the title of the book, but Stephen Post, P-O-S-T, if you find his book, I'm sure it's a beautiful book. He's a great guy. My mother-in-law, when she passed away at home from cancer. And several hours before she died, it was the middle of the night, she asked that the TV be turned off. And she clearly was seeing something that was very beautiful and that was enthralling her. And there was a dramatic change in her affect, and she clearly had a foot in another world. And members of my family who were there were really struck by that. I've had a lot of colleagues report that kind of thing in patients in the last minutes or hour or two of life.
Fascinating. I've been planning on doing a video on that, but I don't know when I'll get around to it. I was going to try to steel man the opposition to read some papers where they try to explain it. Do they have any good explanations for how suddenly somebody could be lucid?
The body constrains the mind, and there can be a point at which, when the body is sufficiently compromised, that it constrains the mind less, and the mind is able to express itself more clearly. I mean, there's a lot that can't be explained in materialist terms, but that's the way I'd explain it.
No, right.
The body is being freed.
I would say the person's being given, some kind of final reprieve. They're given a moment to, have a final conversation or wrap things up before they depart.
Sure. Although I think a lot of terminal lucidity doesn't necessarily entail an accounting with earthly issues. That is, sometimes people with terminal lucidity just seem to see the next world.
Right.
And frankly, they often are quite happy to go there. They're kind of tired of this world.
There was a lady in Mayapur, which is one of the spiritual holy places for Hare Krishnas, who was leaving her body, and she would describe that she would leave her body or go and see the temple, and so she'd report back the clothing that the deities were wearing while she was bedbound, dying of cancer.
Sure, absolutely. It's a very real thing, and again, what is so striking about the materialist approach to these things is that when you see materialists try to deal with these issues, it's obvious that there's no effort to be objective. There's no effort to take these fundamental phenomenologic events seriously. The effort is to simply deny their existence.
Well, it's like
and they'll say anything.
It's like apologetics for materialism.
Yeah, sure. And not to get too theological, but I think the reality, of course, is that materialists are almost invariably atheists. And I think that the denial of God's existence is the motivation for all of this stuff. And whereas Darwin's theory is their creation myth, materialism is their metaphysics.
Yeah.
But their commitment is to the denial of God's existence, and they will do anything possible to defend that commitment, even if it involves complete nonsense.
Yeah, like if you talk about prior probabilities, if you've now debunked physicalism and you know there's a spiritual dimension or something beyond the physical, then denying God's existence becomes much more difficult.
Yeah,
the probability of God existing increases dramatically. Did you want to move on to some more neuroscience?
Yeah, sure. I can mention quickly something that came up in the discussion with
Papineau.
Papineau. That is, I think, absolutely fascinating thing. And I'll mention it quickly because there's a little more after that too. Wilder Penfield was the founder of epilepsy surgery. He was a neurosurgeon, worked in Montreal back in the middle of the 20th century, and he was a wonderful scientist, one of the best scientists that neurosurgery has produced. And he operated on 1,100 patients with epilepsy and really developed the whole field of doing brain surgery to prevent seizures. And his specialty was doing awake craniotomies. And what that is you give the patient local anesthesia so they don't feel any pain. You inject their scalp with Novocaine and so on. The brain doesn't have any feeling at all, so operating on the brain doesn't hurt. And you do the surgery when they're awake, and we still do this. It's fairly common surgery. The purpose of it is to map the surface of the brain. You stimulate the brain with electrodes to find out the regions of the brain where seizures are coming from, or where speech is mediated, or movement is mediated, or sensation is mediated, so that you can remove the seizure area but not cause any damage to critical parts of the brain. And so Penfield did over 1,000 patients with this kind of operation. And he noticed two things that were fascinating. One thing was that he would do hundreds of stimulations of different parts of the brain in each operation. And he could stimulate all kinds of things. He could stimulate sensations where the patients would see flashes of light or feel tingling on their skin. He could stimulate the brain and stimulate movement where the patient would raise their arm or raise their leg. He could stimulate memories where they would have this vivid memory of their mother's face, or vivid memory of their first day of school or being in college. And he could stimulate emotions where they would have intense emotions. They would feel intense pleasure or intense fear. But he noted, and he wrote a book about it actually called Mystery of the Mind, he noted that never once in hundreds of thousands of stimulations of the brain was he ever able to stimulate what he called mind action. And what he meant by that, he defined it basically as abstract thought. He was never able to stimulate a person to think about philosophy or think about logic or do mathematics. And he said, isn't that strange that most of our mental content entails abstract thought? And that's the one kind of mental state that I have never been able to evoke by stimulating the brain. He said, it kind of makes sense then that maybe it doesn't come from the brain. Maybe it's dependent upon the brain for its normal functioning, but the brain is not what gives rise to it. So he said he thought that was clear evidence for dualism. And he actually said that he started out his career as a materialist. And at the end of his career, he was a passionate dualist. He said that this mind action, this ability to have abstract thought, clearly does not come from the brain. The other thing he noticed, which I've noticed too, and it's funny because it's one of these things it's like the elephant in the room. In the study of epilepsy, we have categorized scores of different kinds of seizures. And there are any number of kinds of seizures. There are seizures that involve twitching of a limb, involve losing consciousness and twitching of your whole body, involve sensory phenomena, flashing lights, involve emotions, involve memories, involve complex actions like walking or doing activities. But there are no seizures that evoke abstract thought. There are no calculus seizures. There are no logic seizures. There are no philosophy seizures, literature seizures. Why not? If the brain is the source of all of these thoughts, why wouldn't once in a blue moon a seizure make one of those thoughts happen? Never, ever does. And I calculated just on the back of an envelope one time that in the modern era, say the last couple hundred years, where neuroscience has been done seriously, if you look at the incidence of seizures in the world, there have been 250 million seizures in the world. There's 250 million seizures. And there's not a single report in the medical literature of, probably hundreds of thousands of seizures, of even a single one of them having any abstract intellectual content. And it's exactly the same thing that Penfield noted. And so both from the standpoint of stimulating the brain directly in surgery and from the standpoint of evaluating patients whose brains are stimulated by epilepsy, never is abstract thought stimulated. The obvious explanation for that would be that abstract thought doesn't come from the brain. It's not something that can be stimulated, which fits the Thomistic dualist understanding of the brain beautifully. The second aspect of Penfield's research, and by the way, that particular way of looking at things demonstrates, I think, the immateriality of the intellect, of abstract thought. That abstract thought is not a material power of a brain state. It is a mental state that does not come from a brain state. The other thing that Penfield found, which is also fascinating, was during these hundreds of thousands of stimulations, he would ask the patients under the surgical drapes, he'd say, when you have a chance, just raise your arm or raise your leg, whenever you feel like it, just move. And he said, at certain times, I will stimulate your brain and I will make your arm or your leg move by stimulation. Now, please keep in mind that the patients could not see Penfield. They couldn't hear the stimulation and they couldn't feel it. So they had no way of knowing when he was stimulating their brain. So what he found in what are literally hundreds of thousands of trials is that every single time the patient could distinguish between when the patient moved his arm and Penfield made it move. That is, when Penfield hit the arm area, the patient's arm went up. The patient would say, "You made me do that." When the patient moved his arm, Penfield would say, "What just happened?" The patient would say, "I moved my arm." The patient was never confused as to whether Penfield made a move or he moved, even though the movements were identical. And what Penfield said is that meant that the patient's will could not be evoked. He could not force the will. The patient knew when it was his will to move his arm and not. The patient knew the difference. So there was something immaterial involved in moving the arm that could not be evoked by stimulating the brain. And he said, that's the will, and it's free. I can't force it. So Penfield believed also that he demonstrated the reality of free will.
I was discussing that point in the comments under the video from your discussion with David Papineau, and the person was replying saying, the reason why you can never trigger a sense of agency, the sense that I'm the one moving it, is because when you're stimulating the brain, you're triggering the action in a different way from how the brain normally triggers it. And in this way, they're arguing that it's not evidence that the brain, that we are not identical with our brains.
Well, that would be a way of looking at it. However, you have to keep in mind that the denominator in this experiment is enormous. That is, that Penfield stimulated the brain of 1,100 patients, hundreds of times for each patient. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of stimulations using different current, different locations, different electrodes, different numbers of electrodes, different voltage. And not once was he able to find the will. So if the will is in there, it's awfully secretive. And in addition, on the issue of intellectual seizures, the fact that there has not been a single seizure in recorded medical history out of 250 million seizures, 250 million seizures, that has evoked abstract intellectual content, I would say, yeah, maybe the next one will, but I'm not going to bet on it. So when you have an N of 250 million showing that there are no abstract seizures, and an N of hundreds of thousands of experimental trials during awake neurosurgery, and the numerator for stimulation of agency is 0, that's a pretty good experiment. So yeah, it's possible. But maybe you should also consider, if you're making the argument that, well, maybe we just didn't do the experiment the right way, maybe you should also consider that you have an ideological commitment to materialism and you're simply reluctant to let it go.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the evidence is pointing one way, and if you want to believe differently, that's fine, but that's not the current best explanation based on the science.
Right. If you want to follow the science, materialism is dead in the water.
Yeah.
Okay. And some people have called this promissory materialism, is the name for it. And what it means is, what promissory materialism is a materialist will say, yeah, I know, materialism doesn't make any sense at all, and there's really no evidence for it. But I promise you, when science does more work in the future, they'll prove I'm right.
No, it's yeah.
Okay, fine.
You can also call that one future scientists of the gaps.
Right, precisely. It's science of the gaps, and it really it's not science. It's not even philosophy. It's really rhetoric, and it's an effort to defend an ideology that has vanishingly little logical or evidentiary support.
Prabhupada called it a post-dated check.
Yeah, exactly. My earnest request to my materialist friends is just please let it go. Just let it go and look at the evidence. Take the evidence for what it is. Because frankly, it's fascinating and beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful stuff. It's intriguing. And you don't need to stick to this sort of outdated, idiotic 18th century ideology.
So you mentioned earlier how scientists, and I probably it's true of philosophers too, to a lesser degree, they have a lot of pressure on them to stay within physicalism. You said how for scientists, if they reject physicalism, it doesn't help their career. You know, they might get less opportunities, or less prestige, or whatever.
Yeah.
I imagine the same is not true of neurosurgeons. You know, as long as you can fix people's brains, nobody really cares what your metaphysical beliefs are.
Right. And it's kind of interesting that doctors are not often materialists, nor are, for example, engineers. Materialists in the scientific professions are almost always theoretical scientists. They're not scientists that work in the real world. They're scientists who sort of live in these little imaginary scenarios. And as an example of how difficult this can be, I've been involved quite a bit in the intelligent design Darwin debates, and I have a friend who is a basic scientist, a molecular biologist, who's one of the leading people in this field. He's an exceptionally accomplished scientist, great guy. And I was at a meeting with him one time, and he took me aside, and he said, I've seen what you've been doing with intelligent design and so on. And he said, I'm a Christian. And I think you're right. I mean, I think Darwinism and materialism are grossly inadequate ways of understanding biology. He said, but I can't say that out loud, because I can't say a word about that. He said, because my wife is sick. We need our health insurance. I need my job. And if I said a word about materialism or Darwinism not being acceptable frameworks for doing science, I would never get another grant. I couldn't feed my family.
Right.
And that's true. These, I mean, they will destroy people. They will destroy people's careers. Look what people tried to do to Mike Behe for writing Darwin's Black Box. He's tenured, but in his department, he was treated as a pariah. I mean, if they could have fired him, they would have done it.
I was wondering how he got away with it.
He's tenured, and there have been. I mean, I've gotten calls to my department and my university demanding that I be fired. That's been a fairly frequent thing. I was called a couple of years ago by the campus police that there was a death threat against me, and they wanted to protect me. So this kind of stuff goes on, and some of these people are vicious. So that if you are a scientist, and there are many scientists who really don't buy into this materialist garbage, and scientists who are good Christians or good Jews or good Muslims or good Hindus who really have deep and justified religious beliefs, and for the most part, they dare not say it publicly. Now, being a doctor, I've got a day job. Just statistically, most of the people I operate on believe in God, so I do okay. I mean, I don't really have a problem. I also happen to have colleagues and people who are over me, who are reasonable, decent people who don't listen to these attacks. But a basic scientist who depends on grants for his livelihood will destroy his livelihood by speaking out against materialism or speaking out against atheism by and large.
Death threats is pretty hardcore. I mean, I'm trying to think why somebody would care so much about their metaphysical worldview as to think that it would justify something like that. Like people can believe whatever they want to believe.
Well, what I think, and I've thought a lot about this, like why do people get in this frame of mind? And what I believe, and this is just my speculation, I think the whole thing is driven by a refusal to accept God's sovereignty in the world, by a refusal to take a knee, to say, okay, Lord, I'll do what you want me to do. And people will fight like cats to avoid acknowledging moral law. Because let's face it, it's a lot more fun, at least to an extent, if you don't have to follow rules, if you don't have to do what someone else wants you to do. So people try to justify the way they live their lives by saying there is no God, there is no judge, and there is no consequence, and it doesn't matter. So I'm going to have fun. And if you try to tell them, maybe you're not that free, maybe you do have responsibilities and you do have consequences, they'll fight like crazy to not acknowledge that.
It's funny when atheists try to psychologize to explain away belief in God. That's just your sky daddy that you believe in order to make yourself feel good. It's like, yeah. You can make equal and opposite
arguments. It's just the opposite. Yeah. It's just the opposite. And let's face it, even people who try very hard in their lives to live according to what we believe that God wants us to do, hey, there are plenty of times when a devout Christian is facing a moral decision where there's a little part of you that says, gee, I wish I could just do what I want to do. I mean, everybody wants that. But atheists make it the fundamental principle of their life, which really is to deny God's moral sovereignty. And they will say anything to maintain that fiction.
Well, it's also funny when atheists are arguing that they're purporting that they're presenting that their reason for arguing against religion, for being atheist activists, is that religion is dangerous. So that people who have religious beliefs will do crazy things like give their children homeopathics instead of taking them to see a doctor. And, of course, that kind of thing does happen. But I mean, crazy things happen, and all sorts of bad ideas can anything can become corrupted. But if that's their actual motivation, then, for example, why are they arguing that belief that free will doesn't exist? Because they do experiments and they find if you tell people free will doesn't exist, their ethical behavior declines. So clearly, believing we don't have free will is a dangerous belief. So why promote it?
Well, there are also two problems with the argument, and in some way, this resembles the argument that God doesn't exist because evil exists. That you kind of like you say Christians could do bad things, and so how could God be real if Christians do all these bad things and so on? And the argument is kind of ridiculous. The first point is that there is no metaphysical framework that has spilled more blood than atheism. Nothing has killed people on a scale that atheism has killed people.
No, but when atheists do it, it's got nothing to do with atheism. It's only when theists do it that it's got something to do with theism.
Precisely. The fact that state atheism governed 20 or 30 nations in the 20th century and killed 100 million people, which is the estimate that the people who wrote the Black Book of Communism have said that at least 100 million people died under communist rule. Has nothing to do with atheism. Give me a break. The observation that's been made is that every explicitly atheist government in human history, every government that has actually said this government is atheist, has killed its own people on an unimaginable scale. There's never been a government that has explicitly said it was atheist that was not a totalitarian hellhole. So give me a break. If you want to look at the real world, atheism is a slaughterhouse. The second fact is that I find it amazing that atheists take strong moral positions on anything. That is, for an atheist to say, how could Christians do that? How could a Christian subject their child to an exorcism and not get medical care? That's grossly immoral. But of course, if God doesn't exist, there is no objective moral law anyway. If God doesn't exist, this is a free-for-all. So to what objective moral standard are you appealing if you don't believe in God?
Yeah.
I mean, if you don't believe in God, the only source of morality is just individual people. So why is your morality any better than anybody else's morality? So what atheists do is they implicitly refer to an objective moral standard that by their own denial of God's existence can't possibly exist. If there is good and evil, if there is right and wrong, there has to be some kind of supernatural standard that determines what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah, well, it's like a belief in objective morality it makes no sense on physicalism, because, in physicalism,
Precisely.
you don't even have consciousness. You've just got bags of chemicals interacting. So, I mean, I think the moral argument really boils down to an argument based on consciousness, because the fact that there is another living entity capable of suffering, you first of all, if you want to explain that on physicalism, you need to explain how consciousness exists. So without explaining consciousness, you don't have any materialistic explanation for morality. But second of all, you've got to explain obligation. So even if there is another living entity capable of suffering, why do I have an obligation to act in such a way that takes consideration of this person's suffering?
Absolutely. There was a Jerry Coyne is an atheist evolutionary biologist who has a blog, and he put up a picture years ago of a little child who was in a hospital bed being treated for leukemia. The child looked very sick, and under the picture he wrote, "If God exists, how could this be allowed to happen?" And I posted the same picture with an answer to Coyne, where I said, if God doesn't exist, why do you care? Like, wouldn't this be an evolutionary plus for you? I mean, this kid is somebody else's gene pool. And if he dies of leukemia, it means that your kid has a Darwinian step up. So you should be celebrating. So why would you care about other people at all if there were no objective moral standard? So we all implicitly acknowledge an objective moral standard, which obviously entails the existence of God. Even atheists do that.
Yeah. So the question you can ask is if these people clearly believe something which is inconsistent with physicalism, so they're avoiding. I asked Akandadi this when I had him on, the Vedanta philosopher, and he was saying people are. It's amazing the degree to which people are capable of, I guess you could say, cognitive dissonance. I think he said schizophrenic. They have one belief that entails one thing, but then they just ignore all the things, the entailments of that belief.
Precisely, and it's an error for which they are culpable, meaning that it is such a profound level of ignorance that you have to try hard. In fact, there's an expression in politics that I think applies as well to metaphysics and philosophy, that for you to be that wrong, you have to try really hard. This is not accidental. You have to put a lot of effort into getting it that wrong.
Right.
And that's what these people do. So I should also say that I don't know a great deal about Hindu philosophy and metaphysics, and I'd like to know more. But what I do know about it, I find extraordinarily profound, and I'm fascinated by it. And actually, I'm trying to read more on it because it's insight that, first of all, resonates very nicely, I think, with a lot of Thomistic insight. And it's quite fascinating in itself. So it actually fascinates me.
There's a YouTube channel called Atma Paradigm, which has about 40 lectures on. That's from Akandadi, who I keep quoting. So they're about an hour long each one. Unfortunately, he hasn't written any books or anything, or it's maybe someone can transcribe them all. So you might like to check that out. He argues, gives
Sure.
give how the brain models fail and all sorts of that stuff. He uses a few arguments that I haven't heard you use. One of them is the audio visual desync in the brain. I'm sure you're aware of that.
Meaning what?
So there's a delay in how long it takes for the brain to process visual sensations compared to auditory sensations. So it's a half-second delay, and this creates a problem because he gave an analogy. So if you've got a ship and you get information coming in from the sounds, it's like we've heard a sound, we're not sure what it is. It sounds like thunder. And the captain who's about to send it up to the commander who's about to send it up to the captain's like, well, before we send it up to the brain, we need some visual stimuli. And the visual department's like, oh yeah, we've got something, we're still processing it, it'll take a little while. So there's a dilemma. What do you do? It's like, okay, the visual department's like, why don't you just hold the sound stimuli until I've got my bit together, and then you can submit them together. But then you've got a problem. Then we're just a passive observer. We have no free will then.
Well, if I can just take a moment, that particular observation about a delay in sensory processing was explored in considerable depth by a physiologist in the mid-20th century named Benjamin Libet. And I haven't had a chance to talk here about Libet, but his work is fascinating. He's most famous for his work on free will. But to me, actually, his most interesting work was on the timing of sensory processing. He did a series of experiments in which he would have people have their finger pricked, and they would record on a clock that could record time to within a resolution, I think it's of about 10 milliseconds, when they felt the finger prick. And he had electrodes on their scalp that would record when their brain registered the sensation from their finger. And what he found was that they felt the finger prick within a few milliseconds of the moment that the finger was pricked, but their brain was silent for about half a second, showed no activity at all for about half a second, so that they felt, and they felt the finger prick almost instantaneously with no brain activity associated with it. So essentially, they were feeling their finger without their brain being aware of anything happening in their finger. And he was utterly perplexed by this. He was blown away. And he said that the way he interpreted it was that the brain would backdate. That is, the brain would feel it a half second later, and then you would be tricked into thinking you felt it at the moment it happened. Of course, I think that's a bunch of hand waving. I think what that means is that, and this is really Thomistic in a way, that the soul basically is the entire body. It's not just the brain. We tend to think of the brain, again, as this Cartesian theater. And it's another good argument against the Cartesian theater. We feel a finger prick in our finger, not in our brain. What the brain does, I think, is it interprets it. The brain function is not the primary way that we feel things or see things or hear things. The brain is what allows us to understand them. The brain generates the more complex perceptual and imaginary processes that allow us to make sense of it. But the actual perception, I think, occurs in the sensory, not in the brain.
So this fits into a Vedic idea that the consciousness is described in Bhagavad Gita as that which is spread all over the body. And the soul is described as being seated in the heart. And, blood is also spread all over the body. And, wherever blood doesn't flow, you get problems. So consciousness, it could be that the blood is carrying consciousness all over the body, and our ability, so we're actually, there's neurons in the finger, so it could be that our sensation of the finger prick could be in the neurons in the finger directly, and then the brain later adds interpretation. So if the soul's seated in the heart, then the fact that we're experiencing things going on in the brain, there's also a distance thing going on there. I guess that, you're well outside of the brain model at that stage.
Sure. And I think the Aristotelian or Thomistic understanding of the soul can be of help here, in that it wouldn't make a lot of sense to say the soul is seated somewhere, because a soul isn't a thing that sits in that metaphorical sense. The soul is the active principle of the body. In the Aristotelian way of looking at it, if you take a living human being and the same human being a moment after he's dead, you subtract everything about the dead body from the living person. What remains is the soul. So the soul is essentially a set of abilities, a set of powers. And so they don't sit anywhere. They are the body. They are the living body, minus what would be there if the person were dead.
The Vedas describe the soul as being the size of a point. And of course, a point has no physical dimensions.
Right.
So it's
precisely right. So it doesn't make any sense to speak of the soul as having dimensions. I think what St. Thomas would say is that if you want to speak about dimensions or locations of immaterial things, the most you can say is their dimensions or their location is where they act, but they aren't really there. So the soul isn't really there. It's just that it acts there. The soul doesn't have it there. It's not a physical thing. It doesn't have locations or dimensions.
Possibly, yeah.
It does have places where it acts.
There's some room for interpretation there.
Sure.
Like what could mean by what could be meant by the soul being seated in the heart. It is described like that. So the other thing I was going to say is we do have some delay in our cognitive abilities. You know, like you're closing a car door and you realize, oh no, I need to grab that thing, and you watch your arm shut the door, unable to stop it.
Yes. Well, it's a fascinating aspect of the neurosurgical management of pain is that there are operations that have been developed to help people who have chronic pain. And what the operations do, or at least one kind of operation, is they stimulate the cortex. That is, you place electrodes on the surface of the cortex that are implanted in the body, and you stimulate the cortex, and that suppresses the pain. Which, if pain were experienced by activation of the cortex, then stimulating it would make the pain worse. But in fact, it seems that the role, at least the cortex plays, in the sensation of pain is that it suppresses it. It doesn't mediate it. And so there are a lot of aspects to the sensory system that don't fit the sort of computer or Cartesian theater model of the mind. The brain's role, in my view, in sensation is largely the interpretation of sensations and to some extent the suppression of unpleasant sensations. But I believe that sensations themselves are experienced if one wants to give a location to them in the sense organs, not in the brain itself, be it the pain receptor in the finger or the retina of the eye.
That fits with Rupert Sheldrake's theories. I'm sure you're familiar with his work.
Yes.
And he has some evidence for that too. And you were talking earlier about the difference between people who work in academics, where they're kind of inside an office, versus engineers and scientists that are actually interacting with the world, like neurosurgeons and so on. Sorry, I lost my train of thought explaining that. Where was I?
Sheldrake and
Rupert Sheldrake. So if you ask a scientist or a philosopher or something, they'll say, our ability to perceive is contained in the brain. But then people out there in the world doing real things, such as in the military, they understand these things, and they'll actually tell people, like if you're looking at a camera. Like they've got camera and they watch the soldiers. If you can see someone doing something they're not supposed to, you stare at them through the camera and they'll stop doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And also,
sure.
they train people in the military. If you're following somebody, if you're like a spy, if you're following somebody and you don't want them to see you, don't look at their back. Look at their feet. If you look at their back, they'll turn around and look at you. So the idea here is that our vision, our sensation of the world, our visual perception is actually contacting the world. So, we all have the sensation of being stared at. We're looking at somebody and the person just turns around and locks eyes with us. They don't look around and scan and find us. They look around and stare directly at us, or we do the same thing. We just turn around and lock eyes with someone who happens to be staring at us. And also, he's got the evidence of, he did phone call ones where he had 4 close friends who were one of them was gonna ring the person, And the person who was told to make the phone call was told, think of the person and then make the phone call. And the person who was receiving the phone call needed to guess out of those 4 friends which one of them was calling them. And they got it right. I can't remember what the exact numbers were, but it exceeded what you get just from random chance. So this showed that there was some amount of telepathy going on, even with ordinary people. And if you do it with people who meditate, then the rate goes higher.
Absolutely. I very much believe that. I think, and the interesting thing, I think, is that if one looks at neuroscientific results, and there are many others besides the ones that we've talked about, neuroscience is very supportive of the notion that there are immaterial aspects to the human mind, and is totally open to these kinds of things. So materialism fails across the board to explain any of this.
So we're at 2 hours and 15 minutes. We were going to do 2 hours. I can probably get away with another 15 minutes if there's any more arguments you want to give.
Well, let's see. Yeah, that's good. Let's. There is one more. Well, 2 more things quickly that I can bring up that I think would be rather interesting. The first is the free will experiments of Benjamin Libet, and I'll try to do them very, very quickly. Libet was fascinated with what he called mind time. And what he means by mind time is the timing between brain events and mental events. He wanted to know what happens when you think of something at exactly that moment, what's going on in your brain. So he put electrodes on people's scalp. He had them sit at a table. He put a button in front of them and a clock in front of them. And he asked them, decide to push the button whenever you feel like it. Just whenever you feel like pushing a button, decide to push it. When you decide to push it, that moment, note the time on the clock and the resolution he could get down to about 10 milliseconds, and then go ahead and push the button. So people would do that. And what he found was that about half a second before people were consciously aware of the decision to push the button, they had a spike in their brain activity in a region of the brain that was the premotor area. And he called this the readiness potential. And initially, it looked like when you decided to push a button, you really didn't consciously decide. What happened was the brain made you do it. And that readiness potential preceded your decision, your conscious decision, by half a second. And you were mistaken in thinking that you decided. And the initial view was that this disproved free will. The view was that this proved that you were being driven to do things by brain activity that you had no control over. But Libet, being a good scientist and not a materialist, he was a property dualist, took the experiment a step further. And he asked the subjects, he said, sometimes when you decide to push the button, immediately veto your decision so that you will sit there, you'll say, I'm going to push the button. No, I won't. I'm not going to push it. And he recorded their brainwaves during the veto, and he found that there were no extra brainwaves during the veto. The veto was silent. And he said that what he showed was that there were material influences that tried to get you to push the button, but that you still had a free choice. And the free choice wasn't a material thing. It wasn't a brainwave. So he said that it wasn't exactly that he proved free will, but that he proved that he proved free won't. That is, that you retain the ability to veto decisions. And presumably the veto or the ability to consent to decisions as well. So he was very much a believer in free will. The other experiment that I think is worth noting is a fascinating work that's been done by Adrian Owen, who is a physiologist at Cambridge in England. And Owen has done studies on patients in persistent vegetative state. Persistent vegetative state is a condition of very severe brain damage, where it is assumed from the medical perspective that these people have no internal mental processes at all. That is, the brain is so damaged that the person is essentially a vegetable. They're a husk with no mind at all. Typically, it's from people who have severe brain trauma from car accidents, or people who have massive strokes, or people who have hypoxia to the brain, cut off from oxygen. So these people show no evidence in everyday life of being able to move purposefully, of understanding. They just lay there. So what Owen did was he took his initial patient, he's done many others. Initial patient was a woman in her 30s who had had a car accident, had been diagnosed quite reliably in persistent vegetative state for a number of years. And he put her in an MRI machine, he put headphones on her, and he asked her to think about things. He said, imagine walking across a room, or imagine that you're playing tennis. And he used functional MRI imaging, which images regional changes in blood flow in the brain that are thought to correlate with brain activity. And even though she didn't have much of a brain left, she did have blood vessels. And what he found was that there were patterns of blood flow change in her brain that looked as though she was responding to what he was saying. So he took normal volunteers, 15 of them, put them in the MRI machine, put headphones on them, and asked them the same things. And their patterns of brain activity were the same as hers. So the initial interpretation, of course, was that she could think about things. She just couldn't act on them, but she had mental content. But of course, he said, we don't know if these patterns of brain activity really correspond to thinking. Maybe they're just corresponding to the noises coming in from the headphones. So he did a very clever thing. He put her back in the machine and he asked the same questions, except he jumbled the words. So the questions were meaningless. So he said, for example, instead of saying, imagine you're walking across a room, he would say, across, imagine, room, walking your, so that they made no sense. And her brain went silent. She only had brain activity when what he said to her made sense. And there have been many people who followed up now on Owen's research, and they found that many people in the deepest level of coma, you can communicate with them. You can ask them questions about their family. You can ask them, did your Uncle Joe grow up in Pittsburgh? And the brain activity can tell you whether it's yes or no. And they're right. There have been people, I believe, who've done math in persistent vegetative state. So there is amazing evidence that there was a high level of mental activity going on, even with the most massive levels of brain damage. So I think both Owen's work with persistent vegetative state and Benjamin Leibott's work with free will are fascinating and suggest that a major part of mental activity is not tightly tied to material causation.
I find the free will one interesting because that fits perfectly with the Hare Krishna idea of free will, that we've got basically pushings of the senses and mind. The mind is counted among one of the senses, and we can just get driven around by them like an animal. So the thing that's described in Vedic thought that differentiates humans from animals is that we have an ability to transcend our nature. We can say, I'm not going to be, I'm not going to behave in this way. There's got to be something higher to reality, and we can seek that out. Whereas animals, they just act according to instincts, and they don't really have any choice. I mean, they've got personality types and variety, but more or less they're just functioning according to processes in their brain that are, instinctive.
Well, Leibniz actually described it. He said the unconscious, these readiness potentials, were like a sea of temptation, like waves on the sea. And we're constantly bombarded. We don't have a conscious choice about being bombarded, but we do have a conscious choice and free will as to what we do about the bombardment. We can accept or not accept. And he felt that was where free will acted, which makes tremendous sense in terms of everyday experience and of other philosophical and religious understandings of this, which are quite closely parallel.
Yeah. Was there any final points? I think we need to wrap it up.
I would love to see an increased openness to dualism and to even idealism in science in general, and in neuroscience in particular. I think it would dramatically improve the quality of the science. My favorite quote on this matter was from Roger Scruton, who was a philosopher, I believe a British philosopher and social commentator, who said that neuroscience is a vast collection of answers with no memory of the questions. And what has happened in neuroscience is that people have amassed just unbelievable volumes of data about the brain. but they've forgotten how to ask intelligent questions. And you can't get meaningful answers in science unless you are meticulously careful with the question you're asking. Because if you ask the wrong question, you can never get the right answer. And materialist neuroscientists are always asking the wrong questions.
The quote I like is from Max Planck. He said something to the effect of scientific revolutions happen one funeral at a time.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Well, I would hope that it wouldn't take the passing away of materialists to change this. I'm hoping that maybe we can convince them in this life to see things differently.
We'll see. All right. So thanks for coming on. We've got a debate coming up with you and T-Jump, and we're currently in the process of scheduling one with Matt Dillahunty, and there'll be more planned.
I look forward to it. It should be fun.
If you like this kind of content, please like and subscribe so you can see more of this stuff. Let us know what you think down in the comments. The live chat's going to disappear, so if you've got comments there you want to remain, then please put them down under the video after the live chat ends. And Hare Krishna.